Hi, Ben Constable with you from Spark Systems. Today I'll introduce you to UML class modeling in Enterprise Architect. By the end of the session, I want you to be able to create useful class models like this one that can both facilitate communication and be used to auto-generate project deliverables. Here's what we'll do. First, we'll create an example information model, also commonly referred to as a domain model or sometimes a data model. The point is, we'll model not only the concepts within a particular domain, but the information about those concepts that various systems might need. Most of this session is devoted to this high-level class model. After creating it, I'll show you some quick ways to auto-generate documentation deliverables from it. Then I'll briefly introduce logical class models in the context of designing software systems and generating code for implementation. These last two topics alone deserve significant discussion, so I'd like to delve into them more deeply in a future presentation. Before we start though, I want to give some context on my example domain. You may remember in the last webinar we created a very simple use case model for a webinar management system. I'll use some of the concepts we identified then to create our high-level class model. But we're not just going to parse nouns from the use case scenarios of a single system. This is a more general information model that could relate to several systems. For example, when designing the webinar management system that handles registrations and running the live webinar, you'd use most or all of the model. Another system, like a webinar library that displays web pages featuring past webinars, well, it could populate its page content using only some parts of the information model. If your webinar systems advertise upcoming webinars by interacting with third-party systems, well, other aspects of the same model could be used to define what information is exchanged. So clearly, our first class model will be independent of any platform or implementation technology and applicable to multiple system designs. So in model-driven architecture terms, you'd say it's a computation-independent model. Well, I welcome you to follow along now in your own copy of Enterprise Architect as we get started. So we have an Enterprise Architect model open here, and the first thing we're going to do is create a starter structure for our information model. So under the project root node, you'll have at least one of these in your project. Just right-click it, choose Add a model using the model pattern wizard. The closest pattern that we want is the domain model here under the core modeling technology. And as we click OK, Enterprise Architect will put this starter structure in place for us. So it's created a view here, which contains some useful diagrams to help us get started, and this sub-package domain objects, which contains the UML classes for us. And these represent the concepts in our domain or the things that we want to capture information about. So let's open up the sample diagram there. I'm just going to create a little bit of space by right-clicking the explanatory note and deleting that. Same with the connectors. We haven't really decided what relationships there are yet, so delete those example ones. Just prompted me, yes, I want to delete it from the model, and don't ask me again. We will keep these example classes and we'll just rename them to start modeling the concepts in our domain. So what's one of the key concepts within this webinar domain? Well, an obvious one would be the webinar itself. So just click on the name compartment here and click again to enter in place edit mode and rename it webinar. There's our first concept modeled there, and that's a significant one, obviously. We also have attendees. So just used F2 to rename the class there. We typically use the singular form. We have a host in webinars as well, and a presenter. So now we need to create a new class. How do we go about doing that? Well, typically you'll use the diagram toolbox to add new elements. You can access that from the design ribbon under Toolbox. Alternatively, just click on the double arrows here in your diagram caption bar, and that'll bring up the toolbox for you. So you can just drag and drop a class element onto the diagram to create the presenter concept. And as we do that, we're prompted to enter some properties for this UML class. So the first property here is the name. We're going to call it presenter. then some notes, and there's a whole array of detailed information over here that we can add about this concept. We're going to come back to that later. So just click OK. Now, when you want to throw down a whole bunch of concepts on the page quickly, there's a couple of things you can do to speed up the process. The first is just to avoid that prompt for the detailed information. So you can turn off the prompt from the Start ribbon there under Preferences. You'll notice in the Objects tab the option to edit object on new. So deselect that, you won't get the prompt. Also, regarding the toolbox, you can actually get the toolbox in place over your diagram canvas. So if you just close the toolbox here, you'll notice when I press spacebar, the toolbox is presented for me in place. So I can quickly add a new class for our next concept, which is going to be a presentation video. So for example, we will take a recording of our webinar session. And that's another concept. A webinar will typically have multiple webinar sessions, so it's on the same theme, but perhaps a different time for a different target audience. So let's create that concept, spacebar again, and we want webinar session. Okay, and just finally, you'll notice that we capture the question and answer content on our webinar landing pages. They're organized by discussion topics. So again, create a discussion topic. Each discussion topic will have a number of questions. These are the questions that you submit for us. And hopefully each question will then have an answer. Again, spacebar, new class, and we'll call it answer. So these are some of the key concepts within our webinar domain, certainly not a complete model. But apart from just naming the concepts, we can put meaning into our information model by way of notes. So you saw before when I open up the element properties, so right click, go to properties, there's a place where I can put reference notes. I'm just going to paste in a definition here for our webinar session, which helps give some information about what we want to capture within this concept. So a webinar session, for example, is going to have a starting time, a duration, and so forth. So that's an explanation of the concept that will help our audience. Now we want to consider how these elements relate to one another. Specifically, we want to model the references between the elements, and to do that, primarily, we're going to use the UML Association. To create a UML Association, we simply click on the element of interest. We'll call that our source element, then use the quick linker here simply to drag to a target element. So I'm just routing the connector there, and when I let go of the mouse button, I can choose one of a variety of relationships, but I'm interested in the association. When I select that, I'm prompted for some of the properties of this relationship. Now, I'm going to leave the name there basically as optional. However, I really do want to consider the roles where I'll define the upper and lower bounds on these references and the role names. That can really put some meaning into your model. So what we're doing here is we're saying, how does a webinar, which is our source element, view an attendee? Well, a webinar can have multiple attendees. So I'm going to provide a role name accordingly, attendees, and I'm going to specify upper and lower bounds. So sadly, you can actually have 0 attendees. I've never had that happen, but theoretically it's possible. 0 or more attendees. So 0 is the lower bound, and the asterisk denotes many or multiple attendees. From the point of view of an attendee, well, they can attend multiple webinars, right? So that may be a reference list of webinars there, and we'll say they must at least attend one webinar to be considered an attendee. Okay, so that defines the basics of the UML Association. Now, I should also note that because this is a many-to-many relationship, I'll typically denote that as a bidirectional relationship, meaning that I can navigate from either end of the relationship. So I can simply right-click to change that under Advanced, change direction to bidirectional. You see the additional arrowhead there. Also, if you find that you've routed the connector incorrectly, like the relationship is basically correct, but you're targeting the wrong element, you can change that quickly. So you can just simply drag from one end. Just say, for example, an attendee should actually be associated with a webinar session rather than the webinar as a whole. You could drag from the webinar element and reroute it onto webinar session like that. And then just adjust the waypoints to suit. So I'm just going to use Shift plus click here to quickly add another waypoint like so. So there's our first relationship. We also want to relate the webinar and the host. So just quickly add another UML association to do that. Again, considering the roles, we're going to say that our webinar has a host, one host. So the multiplicity is going to be 1. On the other hand, a host can be the host for multiple webinars. So again, it may have a reference list of webinars, and let's say 1 or more of those. Okay, and similarly for the presenter. So again, considering the roles, we're going to have potentially multiple presenters for a webinar. We've done that before. So presenters is the role name, and we're going to say you need at least one of them, but you can have more. The presenter certainly can present at multiple webinars. So again, a reference list of webinars and 1 or more of those. Now the direction, of course, will be bidirectional because it's many to many. So let's model that, and there's our relationship there. A relationship with the presentation video. So let's say a webinar will have a recording. Again, so a UML Association. Okay, we'll call that presentation video a recording from the point of view of a webinar. We'll say that it can only have one of those, and that a recording may only be associated with one webinar, like so. Okay, just to tidy that up a little bit. And similarly for webinar sessions, we can have multiple sessions for a webinar. So the role name is sessions, must have 1 or more of them, and a session can only be associated with 1 webinar. Okay, so that's going to do for the relationships. I'll leave the other relationships to do with the discussion topics and questions for you as an exercise there. Okay, so something I might just explain though, some of the options that I use when drawing connectors on a diagram. So there's a few things you might want to take note of. Under the preferences here, you'll see the links tab. You can choose to edit a connector, the detailed properties of the connector when you first create it. You can choose the default direction. So you saw that I was using source to target as the default direction when I created a association connector. You can set the default style for generalization connectors, and you may experiment with the exact placement versus center to center. If you put center to center, EA will try to align the connector start and end points with the center of the relevant elements, whereas I typically go with an exact placement. So just to illustrate that, if I drag out from webinar now and route it to the discussion topic and create an association, you'll see this time I'm not prompted, and it takes the exact placement where I left from webinar and where I landed on discussion topic on the edge there. Something else I typically use in this kind of model is I'll use an orthogonal line style. So just to show you that briefly, the line style is orthogonal square, and that just means that it'll only use straight edges basically, or perpendicular edges. So if I go like here, you'll see that it automatically creates perpendicular lines to the start and end elements. And you can easily apply that same style to all other connectors of the same type on this diagram, like so. Now I see a couple of little errors that I should fix up here. Our host element can in fact navigate to webinar by means of this association, so we should make that a bidirectional association. Right click, advanced, change direction, bidirectional. Okay, also I'll just edit this label here just to be consistent and say that attendees have a list of sessions that they attend, not webinars. So edit the label. All right, it just gives a consistent role name there. Now we're going to consider the detailed information that we want to capture for each of our elements, and we're going to use UML attributes or properties to do that. So you can select an element that you want to add the attributes for, right-click and choose Features and Properties, Attributes. That brings up the attributes dialog where we can just start typing in the name of the properties we want to capture. For example, a webinar would have a title and it would have a description. So these are two properties that are really intrinsic to the webinar type. Now you can see that each attribute can have its own type associated with it. And if I look at the drop list, these are more like programming types. In fact, they're Java types, which don't really help us at this high level of modeling. So the reason for that is that each class, when you create it, actually has associated with it a programming language. So if I bring up the properties, you see that the webinar has this Java language type associated with it. Well, in a high-level domain model, you actually want the language type to be none. So it's just meaningless otherwise. We can quickly reset the language option for each of our classes at a package level like this. Just click on top-level package, right-click Code Engineering, and reset options for this package. Yes, we'll save the changes to our diagram. So where there's any kind of language, we want to convert that to none, and we'll process child packages as well. And then when we go back, you'll see that we have just the normal UML type. So if I just double click to open the properties there, now we can choose from the primitive UML type. So we want the title to be a string, of course, and for the description as well, we'll just make that a string. So let's continue to define some more information now for our webinar session. So what attributes do we need for our webinar session element? Well, one thing we want to know is a duration. How long does the webinar go for? And for that, I really could just use the built-in integer type here for UML, and we could say that it's an integer number of minutes. Now, if we know that, we should actually document it. So I do recommend that you include documentation or notes even at the attribute level as well. So I'm just going to paste in a description for our duration, just saying that we're specifying a whole number of minutes with this integer. Well, what other information do we want to capture with a webinar session? Well, one thing would be, for example, the start time. So I'll create a new attribute for that. And with time, you do need to be a little bit careful because what are you actually trying to capture? Is it a very precise moment in time, such as a timestamp? You might use a Unix-style timestamp for that. Or in our case, it's more of a future calendar event. And I found that you want to be careful there to actually use a local time value. So we're going to specify the date and the hour, not necessarily as a UTC value, which is time zone independent. You want to say, for example, I want my webinars to start at 1 p.m. in New York. Regardless of whether they happen to be in daylight time or not, we want it to be at 1 p.m. in New York. For that, you will need a local time. But if you're doing that to then convert it to other times, you should specify a time zone as well. So that will be another attribute that we would require, a time zone, to say what region this local time actually applies to. And another couple of things, we'd need a registration page for our session, so that might be a URL, registration page, and something else I want to capture is like the session status. Is it pending? Is it open? That kind of thing. So session status, like that. Now you see the UML types are not really specific enough for our application here. So what I'm going to show you next is how we can create our own data types or primitive types that are constrained in a particular way to facilitate our modeling here. So just leave those as they are for a moment. To create our data types, we're going to use the UML data type element. And I suggest you contain those in a dedicated package in your project browser. So you can right-click the domain model here, add a package, we'll just call it data types. Like this, we do want to create a diagram, and that is going to be a UML class diagram. Say OK. And if we just open up our diagram now, again using spacebar, I can just create a new data type. So what do we need? For our start time, we would want a local date time data type. Local date time. There's our first data type. What else do we need? A URL. Or rather, to go with our local date time, we would need so I don't want a class. In fact, I want just delete that guy. I want a data type. So it was going to be time zone. That's what we need, time zone, to go with our local date time. And finally, there was a URL type as well. URL, like so. Now, again, I recommend documenting these. So if I just bring up the notes window here, I'm just going to put in some definitions for our data types. Okay, so for our local date time. Okay, so that just defines the information that we want for our data types. Just saying that it's an ISO 8601 compliant type. It's got a particular format that we expect in our particular domain, and just gives an example there as well. So for our time zone, we're going to say that that is basically related to the TZ database that is maintained by IANA. So I'm just going to paste in a little definition for that. And for our URL, well, I'll let you come up with a definition for the URL. So that's basically the data types now. We want to go back and use them. So we've got these attributes like start time that if I just click to go into in-place edit mode, we can now specify an appropriate classifier for that. So insert classifier. You could also do this via the attributes dialog in the types column there. So we want to go to our information model under domain model, data types. It was a local date time. Okay. And our time zone, we actually have a dedicated data type for our time zone now. So again, insert the classifier time zone, and our registration page is going to be of type URL, like so. Now again, we should probably put some notes associated with these attributes. So if I just bring up the notes window there. So providing here some detail about exactly what this attribute is, a concrete example mentioning that the time zone is specified separately on this value, and even linking to the elements where those data types are defined. For our time zone, similarly. Okay, so we give a link to the time zone data type and just mention exactly what value this can contain. And finally, for our registration page, just mention this is basically the URL there. Now, one thing that we haven't done yet is the type for our session status. Now, when you have a range of simple values, I will typically use a UML enumeration. So again, spacebar to bring up the toolbox. You see the enumeration there. We're going to name this session status. And enumeration has a special kind of attribute, if you like, or the enumeration literals as they're called. So we're going to define 3 of those. I'm just going to use a keyboard shortcut to do that, Control-Shift-F9. We're going to say that the session can be complete, the session can be live, like now, and the session can be pending, as in not yet started. And again, we would associate that type with our attribute here, just setting the classifier, insert classifier, and there's our session status enumeration. And we probably should, just for completeness sake, add the notes on our enumeration as well. Now, if we find that some of the elements have attributes in common, we can use UML inheritance to group those common attributes into a superclass or base class. Say, for example, attendee, host, and presenter here. They're all going to have something like your first name, last name, and email. So let's just go ahead and create that as an example. Just using the keyboard shortcuts here to quickly create a few attributes. Okay, so rather than just duplicating each of these attributes under attendee here into host and presenter, we can create a superclass person and put those attributes in the superclass. So let's just go ahead, again, spacebar on the diagram here to create a new class. We want to call it person. And we can simply select those attributes in the project browser and move them under our person class there. So they're not duplicated in any way. Now we can go ahead and use a UML generalization connector to connect attendee, host, and presenter. So we drag from the child class to the superclass using a generalization like so. And we go again from host to person. Sort of tidy that connector up a little bit. But you do see a little problem that's happening here. As I create more and more relationships on the diagram, it does become a little bit messy. You see we've got line jogs. It's because we're showing too much on the diagram. So I'd encourage you to think about just showing one or two aspects of the model on a given diagram, whether it's associations or the model hierarchy, so forth. So what we can do is just save these few changes we've made here, select and copy the elements that represent this mini hierarchy here. So right click and copy, and I'm going to go ahead and create another diagram specifically for our inheritance relationships. So add a diagram, it's a UML class diagram. What do we just call it? Hierarchy, for example. Say OK. Now we can just paste those elements onto the diagram, and where is it under? Just Control V for paste. So what we're doing here is we're just creating simple links here. We're not duplicating the elements in any way. We're just showing them as an inheritance hierarchy by themselves. So what we want to do now, so we save that, go back to our domain objects here, and we can simply delete person off the diagram. But now we're just deleting it off the diagram, not from the model. So delete here, and you see that EA is smart enough to say, okay, I know that these elements inherit from person here, which is not on the diagram, so it uses abbreviated notation from the UML to show the inheritance relationship. Now, if I really do want to show the inherited attributes, I can still do that. And I can use EA's feature and compartment visibility to help me there. So selecting these three classes, I can right-click them, go to feature and compartment visibility, and show inherited features. And I'll just truncate them so I don't blow the size of the diagram out too much. Say OK. And now you can see the inherited attributes from the person class as well. Of course, I can go ahead and create attributes that are specific to each of these elements as well. Like a presenter, for example, should probably have maybe a biography, like so. And that might be a string, like so. One good way to share the model content outside of VA is by publishing it using the publish ribbon here. You can publish it to a document form such as Word or PDF. Just invoking the report generator here, we choose file location and one of many templates. I'm using the data modeling report here. There are numerous options you can set. Then click to generate. I'm just going to view a document that I've already created. And you see here the cover page that we get with the template. And as we drill down into the contents, you see our data types are all documented nicely as well. Our domain objects diagram there, if we zoom in, you see it's a nice diagram format there. Our hierarchy diagram and so forth. Looking down at the webinar session element, you see all of those notes that we put in there against the class and its attribute. So this report can become very much like a specification that anyone that needs to implement a system in our domain can actually use. So another good format that Enterprise Architect provides is web publishing. So you can generate an HTML report. I'm just going to generate this again to the desktop here. There are various options you can set, but let me just quickly generate with the default options. And viewing the result in our web browser this time, of course, we see that we have like a project browser on the left here, so we can navigate the various diagrams. And we can click through onto the elements like a webinar session here and see all of its details, like the attributes, in this case, its associations and so forth. Now, if you wanted to take this kind of publishing to the next level, you can actually share a live version of your domain model to anyone around the world via their mobile browser, mobile phone browser, that kind of thing, using Enterprise Architect's Pro Cloud Server. So these are just two good ways to share your model content outside of Enterprise Architect. To introduce logical class models briefly, I want to compare a logical model I prepared for a PHP system with the concept classes that we modeled together within our webinar domain. So looking in the project browser, you can see I have a model for a webinar library system, and within that are some PHP data handling classes. So these are responsible for helping to put the content on the page for us. So what are some of the differences that we begin to see when we do logical UML class models? One thing to notice, in our system model here, we haven't implemented all of the information model. For example, our webinar pages don't display each of the attendees or even the host, so we haven't included that as part of the model. So our logical class model can actually specialize or be a subset of the overall information model. But then as we look at each of the individual elements, let's zoom in on the webinar element here, and then also in our logical class model, you see some more differences. In a logical class model, you'll start to have what we call UML operations. And these are really important, or methods they're sometimes called, very important for programming. Just for in this example, to specify how the data is loaded and stored. Whereas in the information model, we typically do not use UML operations. We only care about what information is captured, not how it's processed and handled. More differences, if you look at the attribute types, for the information model, we were restricted just to the few standard UML primitive types, string, integer, so forth. In PHP, you don't actually have a strong typing concept for class member variables. So in EA, that's represented as the type var. So there's another difference. The scope operator as well, very important in a programming sense to see which, as it's the little plus on the left-hand side there, is it a public, private, protected member variable? Can other classes access that member variable? In information modeling, it's really not so important. We also see, if we look at the enumeration in UML, we were able to use a UML enumeration to help define our session status values. Well, in PHP, it doesn't really have a built-in enumeration type, so I actually had to model an additional enum class, an abstract class there, to help implement our session status values. So there are a few differences, but they're certainly worth pursuing when you're modeling logical classes, because you can actually automatically generate code, and that's what I want to look at next. If we look to our project hierarchy here, we can tell EA to automatically generate the code for us for an entire branch of the model here, or for specific packages. Simply right-click, choose Code Engineering, generate source code, and I'm going to have EA generate all of my data classes here just at the desktop. Just click Generate, and EA is very quickly putting out the corresponding PHP code for me into files. So let's have a look at the result there. If we click, for example, in our webinar session, and from the code ribbon here, choose Edit Element Source, and there we see the PHP code that Enterprise Architect has generated for us. All of the documentation notes that came from our information model are captured there for us as well. And we have good synchronization between the code and the model now, or traceability rather. We can simply right-click on a definition here and search for that in the project browser, and there it is. We can also go the other way. So, for example, if I go to our little enumeration here and I want to add another enumeration literal, So session status here, edit the source code for that. And I can even delete things outside of Enterprise Architect or within the built-in code editor. Delete those functions, don't want them. But I do want a new enumeration literal called cancelled. Well, what I can do is tell EA to synchronize that change I just made in the file into the model, and it should bring that in for us. So if we look at our webinar session status enumeration rather, search for that in the project browser. There it is, and Enterprise Architect has modeled that new attribute basically that it's found in the code. So this is a really useful exercise, especially the reverse engineering part. Even for PHP, I found looking at a legacy system that needs further development, I could find opportunities for code reuse and simplifying the code base. And at Spark Systems, we do use this aspect of Enterprise Architect to great effect and for various languages. So today we've seen how to use UML classes to help us create an information model, and ours was a platform and computation independent model. We used the UML Association and generalization relationships to help define the overall structure of our domain model, and we used the UML properties or attributes to define the detailed information that we wanted to capture about that domain. Then we saw how to share the model content with stakeholders outside of EA by way of the generated documentation. We've briefly reviewed logical class models and seen how they can target a specific system by way of using platform-specific data types and constructs. We used that logical model to give us a productivity boost by auto-generating more of the project deliverables than is the PHP code, which we could then keep in sync with the logical design by way of reverse engineering. So that's it for today's session. If you'd like to see earlier webinars, and the first one in this particular webinar series, you can go to sparksystems.com/webinars. Also, our partners provide training and professional services, so some more detailed and hands-on guidance if you need that. We always welcome your feedback, so please get in touch with us, webinar@sparksystems.com. Well, that's it for today. Until next time, happy modeling.